Hey everyone, it's 9:27 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, September 5th, 2022. I guess Labor Day today. But if you heard the traffic outside my house, you wouldn't necessarily think so. It's a little lighter than normal, but it's a busy road, and a lot of people have to work today, so I didn't even know what the point of making it a holy day is, but whatever. So I don't know if I'm going to be revealing anything astounding, but I think this information will have some relevance and importance. Just kind of file it away in your little brain database like I do, and maybe it'll get, recalled later. Who knows? So there's this portion in the book of Daniel, basically from, it's like Daniel 2:4, as soon as the line, then spake the Kashdi, or Kashdim, to the king in Arami, not Syriac. So that's when this portion starts that they say is Aramaic. But it's really weird. And now the Aramaic, so-called in the Bible, they used to, a lot of concordances and lexicons just called it Chaldean, which again is, I don't know how you get Chaldean from Kashdi, which is just K, Sha, D, Kashad, Im. I don't know how you get Chaldean. But anyways, they used to just call it Chaldean. Because modern Aramaic's not really so much like this. What this section, and there's a couple of little sections in Ezra, maybe Nehemiah, where a letter to the king of Paris is being reproduced. So little sections that might be in this language. It's really strange because it's actually written in the same character as the rest of the Bible, what we'll call Masoretic Hebrew character. And a lot of the words are actually the same. They're written the same, they're pronounced the same. A lot of times they'll have very similar Mazora or Nakud, the dots and dashes on them. Sometimes different, but very, 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 very similar. But there are certain things that they seem like arbitrary changes, like certain glyphs seem to be arbitrarily changed, like the T's oftentimes seem changed to the sh. Weird things, like the tsa changed to an o, which seems relatively consistent in a lot of terms. It's what it makes it seem weird, not like it's its own unique special language, but like it was just some sort of an ad hoc kind of language that was used mostly from Daniel 2:4 to Daniel chapter 7, the end of chapter 7. Now, what makes it strange that this very odd language was used in these passages is because starting in Daniel 2 and then ending in Daniel 7, and you do have some odd chapters in between, which I won't really go over now, but really especially in Daniel 2, very especially in Daniel 7, there's a lot of information concerning the kingdoms that would exist from the time of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. He was the king of the Kashadim, or Chaldeans, and he had a dream. The way the story goes, he had a dream, and he didn't just want an interpretation of the dream, because how difficult is that? You could go to a dozen dream experts, psychologists, whatever, and they could give you a dozen different interpretations if you told them everything you dreamed. And he was probably pretty smart, because I don't think people back at this time were stupid. He was probably smarter than what most people would give him credit for. as were probably most people. The man on the street back at this time, I'm sure, was 10 times smarter, maybe 20 times smarter than the man on the street today. We're so dumbed down deliberately. So he knew that nobody's going to be able to give him some kind of an accurate interpretation. If he tells them what he dreamt, they could pull anything out of their ass. Which is exactly what I think a lot of those dream expert psychologists today do. You know, do they tend to ascribe consistent meanings to certain things? Yeah, they do, but so what? It still doesn't make it right. So he was very smart in the sense that he said, I'm not going to tell anyone what I dreamed. If you guys are worth your salt, you're going to tell me what I dreamed, and you're going to give me the interpretation of it. And of course, nobody could, because they were all frauds, like so many spiritualists, the vast majority are. So then comes Daniel. And as the story goes here, in Daniel 2, he's given the revelation of what the dream was and what everything meant, the representation of it. Now, a lot of people are familiar with this because this is like a core passage for any, it's mostly churches, but, you know, for anybody who teaches eschatology. And what does eschatology mean? It means study of the last things. So this is like the cornerstone. Really, it's the cornerstone of what the Bible has to say about world history, kingdoms and politics from the time of Nebuchadnezzar forward to at least a certain point in time that we'll see in the interpretation of this dream. And we get sort of a different aspect of that in Daniel 7, also in this weird ad hoc language that they try to tell us is quote-unquote biblical Aramaic. So, and for anybody who's not familiar, the dream is he sees a statue, okay? And as the vast majority of interpretations go, it is described, so Daniel comes to him and he says, here's what you dreamed. You saw this big statue. The head of it was made of gold. The chest and arms were made of silver. The belly and the thighs were made of, now here's it, some say brass. A lot of them say brass, but it's actually the word nehush, which is usually translated as, well, it can be translated as brass or bronze, but a lot of people would actually err on the side of maybe a little bit more sense or safety and say copper as a pure element, copper, as opposed to, because if you're going to say brass, then you have to say it was mixed with what, tin. If you're going to say bronze, you have to say it's an alloy, not a pure elemental metal. So then he says, then the legs, you saw the legs were, and according to the translation, he said you saw legs of iron. So it's barzal, or actually in this this ad hoc Aramaic, I believe what they do is they change the B to P, and I got to go a lot further forward than I am right now to a P. So instead of barzal, it's parzal. They do this. That's a good example of how this ad hoc sort of Aramaic, it just swaps out glyphs as they please. So anyways, and he said, then you saw these feet and toes that was made of iron and clay. And virtually all the translations out there stay very close to the same on this. Now, this word that is translated as clay, it appears about 8 times in these ad hoc Aramaic portions, and all of them in Daniel 2. The word it's chesap. The thing is, the first glyph is an H, but what I've found over the years is that I used to pronounce that H in an aspirant very breathy, and I might have a couple of years ago pronounced it hussup. Though I've found that phonetically, for reasons of both hearing it and the type of glyph that it is more proper, and the amount of transliterations, the way I've seen it transliterated, it's more of a hard sound, more of a CH, like a hard CH. So if you think of a number of words that actually have the CH in them, but it's pronounced as a hard CH, cuss up, okay? There's this word, cuss up, and it's translated as clay. So we get this idea, or this picture, that as we go down this statue, we go from gold to silver to copper or brass to iron, and maybe brass. The reason being brass or bronze because of how strong they are. Even though it's an alloy, we're going to get into alloys. So it's possible that we are looking at brass, which would be an alloy of, I believe, copper and tin, bronze, alloy of copper and zinc, are strong, probably stronger than copper, even if you worked copper in different ways and stuff, just sitting by itself. Then iron. And then we have these feet and toes, and these are oftentimes a focal point, of course, because the vast majority of people that get into eschatology want to claim that we are in the last days. They do want to claim this idea that the world kingdoms went Babylon, using their terminology, Babylon, Medo-Persian, Grecian, Roman, and then your last one is very up in the air, and there's been many, many, many interpretations of that. So the thing is, I think if we stick with a little bit more consistency regarding what he's seeing, we might get to maybe a little bit better understanding of what's being relayed here. What are its implications? I'm not entirely sure yet, but a few things about this. One is that if you look at other words, both in this ad hoc Aramaic and Masoretic Hebrew, that start with the H glyph and the S glyph, ches, you're going to oftentimes see strength, something about being strong, okay? That's one thing. Another thing is if you go searching, and I'll just give it to you this way, because I'm getting ahead of myself. Iron and clay don't fit. They don't fit the image, and they don't fit the progression that we would be seeing in the image. If we start with gold at the top, that's going to be the purest, and it's going to be the purest, it's going to be the rarest, but it's going to be the softest metal of all. You go to silver, not as rare, not with the sort of pure conductivity qualities and preservation qualities as gold, so not necessarily considered as valuable a metal as gold. However, silver is stronger in structure than gold. Now you get down below that, and this is why I said I don't know if this would be copper or if it might be more correct to say this is bronze or brass, is because, again, copper especially is not nearly as rare as silver. It's far more plentiful, still to this day. Stronger, especially in the sense of when it's alloyed, as in bronze. Bronze is actually extremely strong metal. Copper is pretty strong metal too. I've worked with copper quite a bit. I mean, even copper with a pretty small wall to it is a pretty strong metal just in and of itself. Not as rare. The legs, iron. All right. Iron is quite strong. Very strong. And I'm going to talk about that just a little bit more, about the strength, the potential strength of iron. Of course, iron is quite plentiful. Far more plentiful than copper. In fact, if you visit, just as a good example, a place that's close to me, if you visit the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, if you visit northern Wisconsin, or like the Mesabi Range in Minnesota, and I'm pretty sure there are ranges, iron mines in Canada too, just all around Lake Superior. The amount of iron in such a vast area is mind-boggling. The Mesabi Range alone is, I don't remember how many miles long. These enormous pits of iron. Iron is very rich in the earth, and it is far more rich in some places than others. But very plentiful, not even close to as rare as copper. Very strong, much stronger than any of these metals. Even copper in alloyed form, iron stronger. And then we get to the feet. And we've seen a pattern so far of a rarer metal. I don't know if I'd say more pure, because if these are elemental metals, they're all pure. Rarer, more rare, but weaker at the top as a structural metal. You get down to the legs, not as rare. Iron is very plentiful, depending on where you are, I suppose, but there's iron mines probably in most countries of the world. They're just not as big as the mines that I know of and have seen around Superior, for instance. The Superior mines fuel the steel industry in America, and possibly a lot of it worldwide. You can't say enough about them. Anyways, so we see a pattern going down to the legs, and then we get to the feet. And now we're supposed to believe that the feet is not following this pattern that we're seeing. Now we see the feet, some sort of a weird-ass fusing of iron, strong iron, and clay. Now you can find a lot of iron in clay, more likely in rock, but you go to places like the Upper Peninsula that's so loaded with iron. You'll see the iron in the clay. You'll see the iron in the rock, in the dirt, in everything. It's so red. The hills are red. Everything is so red. But then you think, fusing iron with clay. Well, you don't fuse iron with clay. Now, clay by itself is remarkably strong if you fire it correctly. In a kiln, you can create a material that's remarkably strong, which is bricks. So yes, clay can be very strong in and of itself. Of course, no brick is nearly as strong as an iron tool. No brick is nearly as strong as even a good copper tool. I don't even know, you could probably take a nice silver hammer and bust up a brick. Bricks are strong because they have a lot of compressive strength when you put a lot together. But this idea of mixing clay and iron just doesn't follow the pattern is the problem. It doesn't follow the pattern, and it doesn't follow reality. However, since there's a real issue with this word chesed, and since most other languages that would transliterate the ches would make that first H sound hard, ka, ka. You look at a lot of languages, and you'll notice something, that kol in most languages starts with that hard k, k, k sound. Even in the Latin languages, it's usually called something like carbon. Carbon. What's strong? Carbon. Carbon is strong. And the interesting thing is this. So, iron can be very strong. Wrought iron is actually very strong. Wrought iron can be stronger than steel. Cast iron, not as much, because you haven't done the work of really compressing the iron molecules in cast iron. Even though cast iron is very strong, cast iron pot, something that you have that's cast iron, is very, very strong. Not as strong as steel. So the thing is, let's say somebody just made a mistake and they accidentally, we'll say it was an accident, translated a word that maybe should have been taken as something kind of dirty, or maybe not. Maybe just a strong earth element, and made it clay instead of what maybe it should have been, which was carbon. Now the funny thing is, if we put carbon in there, as in i.e. coal, which coal represents one of the best sources for carbon, especially in metallurgy, what we now have is pig iron. And if we go one more step past pig iron, we have steel. Now, if we were to insert in those the feet with the 10 toes steel instead of iron and clay, we would first off have a consistency of form from the head to the feet. We would also have a mix that makes complete sense in the real world. Because for those who don't know just the basics of how steel is made. So with steel, you take iron ore. You could take raw ore, or these days pretty much most steel mills are, they're just using what's called taconite. So little balls of iron that are actually made on site, usually at or near the quarries where they're taken from, or the iron pits. Sometimes they're sort of quarries, sometimes they're iron mines in caves, but whatever, the iron mine. They're made into these little balls that are pure. So it's much easier to get good ore and good pig iron from these balls that are made, called taconite. So you take taconite and you put it in a blast furnace with coke. Now what coke is actually a product of just regular old coal. So you take raw coal and you load it into these they're tall, thin, but very, very deep ovens, and it's baked in there for quite some time. It's usually a day, close to a day. And then what you have after that baking for quite some time, you have a byproduct which is used as a fuel, and then you have coke, which is simply that coal reduced down to its purest, best burning form. And they take that coal and they quench it, and then they add it to the taconite and limestone in a blast furnace. And what that does is the coke, as well as them blasting air into the blast furnace, it heats everything up a few thousand degrees, and it burns off the oxygen in the iron. And what you get is a very pure form of iron, except, and then the limestone actually, sort of acts as a sponge and pulls off impurities and creates something called slag, and then that's taken off. And they tap at the bottom because the slag sits on the top. They tap what they call pig iron, and I would not believe the story of why they call it pig iron if I were you. I think they call it pig iron because it's actually dirty iron. If you consider the carbon or the coal dirty, pig iron, because pigs wallow in dirt. So you get pig iron. Now you can form a bunch of pig irons in little molds or big molds, and you can put them into a basic oxygen furnace, which is like a Bessemer. Or you can put it in these big long furnaces. Now I forget the name of them. And what you do is you further refine the carbon content out so that you get a more... you will lose, in a sense, when you take more of that carbon out, you will lose a certain amount of strength, but you'll gain this flexibility, which gives it a nice balance between strength and flexibility. And that's typically your steel. A relatively low carbon content, but it's pure, it's had that oxygen, because, iron and oxygen together are rust, they're not as strong. You get steel. So it is the forming, essentially, of iron with carbon, and you want a low amount of carbon to get sort of your best steels, and then a lot of, which is an alloy. Then it's not a pure element, it's an alloy. The thing is, iron, you could have stronger iron than steel, because wrought iron is actually stronger in many ways than even very good low carbon steel is. And there's different grades of carbon in steel for different applications. However, to get iron that is as strong or stronger than steel, you have to work it a lot. That's why they call it wrought iron. Wrought iron's very strong, but it requires a lot of work. Now, steel, you can make steel in these gigantic, enormous batches, and they do. And so it's actually a much cheaper material for all sorts of applications than, of course, wrought iron is. Even though today with pneumatics you can produce wrought iron much faster, it's still never going to be as economically feasible as steel. But here's the thing. When you infuse that carbon via coal into iron, it becomes partly weak and partly strong because of the infusing of the carbon in the iron, thus making an alloy instead of pure iron, which, if you just put the time in, you could make wrought iron and you'd have something as strong or stronger. With a lot more, really a lot more preservative qualities in general than steel, without mixing more different elements to it to make another alloy, say like stainless steel or other kinds of alloys. So like in Daniel 2:23, when he says his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of, what's that word? Kesep. Now I will insert here carbon, okay? And you tell me if it makes a little bit more sense in reality and a little bit more sense just in the context of this statue and what the king is seeing. His legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of carbon. Thou saw till that a stone was cut without hands, which smote the image upon the feet that were of iron and clay and brake them into pieces. Now I haven't gone too deep into this whole idea of this stone, aben, which is at least some type of building material. I don't know if it's always stone or not. It works in a lot of contexts. But then it says without hands, and again you have this ad hoc Aramaic, but I won't go too much into that. It smote the image upon the feet. The feet were this material, this alloy, which were of iron and what I say would be carbon or steel. Smote the feet and the toes of steel and break them to pieces. Then was the iron and carbon, or the steel, the perhaps brass or copper, the silver, gold broken to pieces together and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. That word there is nothing like the Masoretic Hebrew word for mountain, but we'll continue on. Now, so this is the dream. We'll tell the interpretation. And then he says, you're the first king, and forget the God of heaven has given you kingdom, power, strength, and glory. Wheresoever the children of men dwell, and beasts of the field, if you say so, and the fowls of the heaven is given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them. Thou art this head of gold. After thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth, or copper. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as parzal, iron. For as much as iron break in pieces and subdues all things, wrought iron, because it's so strong. And as iron that breaketh, all these shall it break in pieces and bruise. What did that kingdom do? Well, I think it broke in pieces everything we understood about the world. And it destroyed. We see that in the fourth beast in Daniel 7, that it says it stamped the residue with its feet. It destroyed everything concerning our knowledge and memory of the past and who we are and what the world was and how the world really worked. Made us believe that we came from idiots and that we were just getting smarter, as opposed to we came from people far more intelligent and they had made us stupid. Now, continuing in 241, and whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of, now in here they want to say potter's clay, but they say pechar, and then chasep. And I did do a little study on this, this word pechar a long time ago. It's funny that chacham in Masoretic Hebrew is coals. It's actually coals. But continuing. So let's say, as you saw this, the feet, the toes, part of carbon and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron. For as thou sawest the iron mix with the carbon, as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of carbon, the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And what makes steel brittle is the carbon. It makes it strong, but it makes it brittle. And whereas thou saw iron mixed with some sort of carbon, coalish carbon maybe, but they change the word here. They change it to this thene, which I think thene only appears once or twice, and they make it miry both times. Thene. They shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. This passage is very dubious, by the way, but shall not cleave one to another, even as the iron's not mixed with clay. It's because it's so many principalities that are essentially holding sway over the whole world with a very steely grip. And I think because they have extended this kingdom out in so many ways to so many different tribes of people that are essentially, I shouldn't have used that word because I was going to say essentially essential, to the steely grip that they have on the world, that it makes it quite strong, but brittle. And then it says, in the days of these kings, the God of heaven set up a kingdom. He'll set up a kingdom in the days of those kings. So during the kingdom of that last, the feet and toes of what I say is likely steel. He'll set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. So we have the imagery of this stone smashing the feet. The feet support the rest of the body. It's all destroyed. It's all destroyed. Now, the interpretation of that stone and all of this is very arguable. It's very debatable. So I'm not going to go into that. But I'll tell you, if there's one material that I could think of that has probably had the most profound effect and use on the world as we know it, I'd say that's steel. Structural steel. And all the products that steel makes. I mean, you look at these steel mills. Some of them specialize in beams, steel beams for structural steel, and other components that make, like the webbing of trusses, structural steel. But they have different plants in these steel mills. You know, once they make the actual steel, then they have to take it to different portions of the mill that will make it into different things. You know, there's the rolling mill, and that's one of the most prolific products that are made in steel mill is the sheet metal, the rolls of sheet metal. And so some steel mills specialize in rolling steel, and sheet metal is used so much in so many things that we just take for granted. There's so there's not only the sheet metal, the rolled steel, there's the it's the not sheet. See, I forgot. It's the thicker, so you would use it in a lot of bridges and stuff for the walls. Really heavy applications. And I'm sure somebody out there is thinking, oh, it's this. So it's literally just like rolling it into a much thicker, it's sheet, instead of the very thin, which is like mills. It's quite a bit thicker. So there's that. There's steel wiring, steel tubing. So much of everything that we experience in the world today, the modern world, is defined mostly, in my opinion, I think it's not just my opinion, by steel. So now there's the aspect of this concerning what are the implications. That part I'm not entirely sure of. The reason is this. I don't necessarily think the implications are... Well, it's because all of these great modern steelworks are as new and modern as they say. They may have been, or some of them may have been far more modernized. Or many of them were built in the mid to late 1800s or early 1900s. You know, and especially the one that sticks out to me the most is, for instance, like the Bethlehem, Pennsylvania mill. The idea of building such a thing without infrastructure in place to do so, i.e., all of the tooling that you're going to find in these mills, it all had to be made in foundries. Basically, really large, accurate sand molds had to be made for all of these different kinds of instruments. All of these tools, one thing you'll notice about a lot of these tools and a lot of these steel mills is how well they function, how many of them function pneumatically, and how old they seem to be. Still in really great shape. That was the one thing that struck me about all the mining tools that I saw when I went up to the Iron Mountain Mine near Vulcan, Michigan. I don't know that that necessarily means that all of these steel mills are so new, but that there's far more, because of how cheap That's the one thing I think that should be taken away from this, or a big thing that should be taken away from this. How cheap it is to produce steel. And maybe that should be a sign to define how low we have sunk. Kind of like light wood construction. Homes that are made from light wood construction are essentially slave homes, McMansions. So I don't know, I'm sure plenty of mills have been built in modern times in the last century or so. But I do have my doubts that a number of them, the older ones too, were built in modern times. I don't think necessarily because we're seeing this sort of imagery going from the gold down to the feet and toes, which I say is more likely steel than a mix of iron and clay. I don't think that necessarily means that there weren't the same kind of advanced steel processing facilities, at least available in certain nations and places, but that it became very much a defining element to a kingdom. So perhaps we could see it as more definite in perhaps the kingdom that existed before the modern age of steel. We could see wrought iron as more of a defining element, and perhaps before that we could see copper or maybe bronze or brass as more of a defining element. And the other thing you have to consider is the changeover in these kingdoms did happen so quickly. Babel, or as we know it, Babylon, was only a great kingdom for maybe a century as far as having hegemony. Paris and Madi came from sort of far away, and they became dominant, at least in the land where these things occurred. They took over all of the holdings of Babel. Babel had taken over all of the holdings of Asher before them and much of Mitzrayim before them. And this is how it happened. These kingdoms, not only did they have their own realms and lands that they controlled, but once they took over the kingdom that existed, that had already taken over 2 or 3 before them, they just increased and increased and increased and increased. And a kingdom known in the Bible as Yun took over what Paris and Madi had. And then after that, I would say the kingdom today that we know of today basically blended from Yun to more of a conglomeration of powers, and then simply evolved over a small amount of time, probably only a century or so. A lot of these things happening within probably the last century or two into this modern kingdom that we see represented here in Daniel 2 as these, again, in my opinion, steel feet and toes. So maybe there are a lot more implications about this than I've been able to think through. And you can let me know what you think of that. But that right there is all I have to say about this portion of Daniel, and I think it fits far better. And the thing is, I don't have to stretch any of these words or terminology, because we are looking at words that, again, are in a minority language that we have no proof is actual a language. It's more of an ad hoc kind of language that really has all of the earmarks of somebody changing one language into a sort of code language that was much harder to understand. And why? I would say the reason is because these passages actually cover world history and politics far better or let's say far more completely than any other passage that I'm aware of in the Bible. And I'm not going to get into Revelation. Revelation is at best just an absolute jungle of people giving a million different interpretations of what they think of all of that, and it is so messy. But I just want to stick with what is the foundation or the cornerstone of eschatological thought, and it is these passages from Daniel, which, darn, they have been made into a language that is even difficult to understand, even if you have a good understanding of Masoretic Hebrew. So, kind of a lot there. But again, I think that these things are pretty important. They can definitely be facts that you log back in the back of the mind until they're brought again to mind, depending on what you're looking into in the future. So with that, I will let you guys go, and hopefully all of you that got the day off today can enjoy it. So we'll see you next time.